these videos, we sit down and chat with prominent guests here at FAIR and NHH. Today's guest is a leading expert in Africa, a pioneer in the use of randomized control trials, and a front figure in the movement for transparency in the social sciences. Welcome to Coffee with Ted Miguel.
Tusen tack.
Ted, yesterday you gave this year's Life is a Lab lecture to a crowd of 500 business school students here at NHH. How was that?
It was great. It was a great experience, a very lively group, and really a pleasure to be here.
Wonderful. The title of your lecture was Climate and Conflict. What was the main message that you wanted to convey to the audience?
The main message is that the world is warming. We know global warming is a big problem, a big challenge. And the goal was to convey to the audience that there's a body of research showing that when temperatures warm, there's more violence. And we looked at this issue in many different ways. We looked at this issue in Africa, my own area of expertise and focus. We also looked at this in other parts of the world. So from everything from African civil wars, which increase at high temperatures when there's a hot year, to crime in the US or Australia, we see that when it's warmer, when it's hotter, people behave more violently. And the goal was to bring that research together for this audience.
Which could explain why Norway is such a peaceful country.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah, exactly. Everybody was so polite during the talk. Yeah.
So Ted, you're at the leading business school in Norway. Why should business school students care about this topic?
It's a great question. The implications of climate change extend beyond just violence or political instability. There are likely to be huge implications for the economy. So some of the research that I talked about yesterday in the lecture was also how when temperatures warm in most of the world, economic growth slows. And there's a number of reasons for that. The most obvious one is that at very high temperatures, especially also when it's dry, agriculture doesn't do as well. So in Africa, India, Brazil, hot and dry years are years where the agricultural sector does poorly. But it actually goes beyond that. There's evidence that labor productivity in factories is lower when it's hot. There's evidence that cognitive performance on test scores is lower when it's hot. Just across a range of different economic activities that affect productivity, the economy is affected by high temperatures. So for people interested in business or government, it's something they need to be aware of.
Interesting. How did you become interested in this topic?
It's a real roundabout story. I didn't start out working on environment. I specialize in African economic development. I've been working in East Africa since my dissertation days 20 years ago. And I started working in Tanzania on a project to study really local government finance. I was working in a district in Tanzania called Meatu. And what I found out shortly after getting there was that this region of Western Tanzania was famous for witch killing. And it sounded crazy to me that this was still going on in this day and age, but there are hundreds of women, mainly old women, killed every year as witches. They account for half of all murders in this part of Tanzania. So it's just an incredibly widespread phenomenon, and I started wondering, how is this happening? Why is this happening? I started collecting data from local government officials on witch killing and witch attacks. Over time, I got historical data on the witch killings. I was actually, as a researcher, very nervous when I started asking these questions to the government officials. I didn't know how they would react, but it was just a normal thing. They just gave me data like any other data on witch killings. And what came out of that analysis from all the data we had collected was there was a very strong link between witch killings and years when it was hot and dry. When there was extreme drought, those were years with lots of witch killing in the data in this part of Western Tanzania. So it started me thinking about what could be causing it and really changed my research career. This observation in the field made me appreciate an issue that I hadn't thought about before. And it suggests that extreme resource scarcity, these years when agriculture fails and people are very poor, are years where society is very stressed and there's more violence.
Yes, so let's talk about the mechanisms. Hot years, economic scarcity. Is that the main challenge through which climate can affect conflict?
That's something we're making progress on as researchers. There's certainly a lot of evidence that the economic channel does matter. So, for instance, in some other studies in Africa that have looked at the link between high temperatures and violence, they found that it was high temperatures in the months of the year where crops grow in the growing season that's what leads to more violence. High temperatures in other parts of the year don't. So it really feels like that economic agricultural channel matters. At the same time, this is an area of a lot of debate among researchers because we find the same relationship for crime in the US or Australia, meaning a hot week or a hot month in a city has more crime than a cool month in that same city. So that kind of short-run response in a wealthy society can't be due to the same sorts of channels as in Tanzania or in East African countries. So what we've looked at is actually a bit beyond our original research area in economics. We've looked to the psychology literature and the neuroscience literature. And there's a body of literature in those disciplines showing that behavior can change at high temperatures, that there may be less impulse control, that there may be changes in serotonin or other brain chemistry that could affect behavior. So those channels are still being investigated, but it feels like on top of the economic channel, there's almost certainly a psychological channel at work.
And I know you're investigating these things more closely in Kenya as we speak.
Exactly, with a colleague of yours.
Yeah,
we're trying to understand in a controlled environment.
Ingvild almost. Yeah.
Exactly, with Ingvild, and we're running labs in Berkeley and in Kenya actually on this channel to try to understand if it's something general. How does economic behavior, how do choices change when people are in a hot, uncomfortable setting?
Interesting. Now, clearly, conflict can have many sources, political ideology, perhaps ethnic tensions, and a fight over resources. How important is climate change in this respect?
This is also a great point. By emphasizing climate the way we do, we're certainly not implying that other things don't matter. Exactly as you said, if we look at specific conflicts around the world, there's so many political, social, religious, and other causes, 100%. But what we are finding is that climate can explain a substantial share of conflict. So to give you an example, a colleague of mine at Berkeley, Solomon Shang, did a fascinating study where he looks at the El Nino weather pattern. As we know, every however many, 9, 10 years, there's cycles with warmer, drier years and then cooler, wetter years. And he looks at the regions of the world affected by El Nino and finds that in the hot, dry part of the cycle, they have a lot more civil war. And that increase in temperature and dryness just due to El Nino can explain something like 20 to 25% of all new armed conflicts, like civil wars, in those mainly tropical regions of the world. So we're certainly not saying climate can explain everything, but it explains a share that's very important to understand.
In your talk yesterday, you emphasized Africa and the troubles that Africa are in and will be in. What can the world do to alleviate these problems? And does Norway, as an oil-producing country, have a particular responsibility in helping Africa?
So I think sub-Saharan Africa is really the front line when we look at climate and conflict. The baseline rates of conflict are high, and many parts of sub-Saharan Africa, in fact, most of sub-Saharan Africa, will be adversely affected by climate change. So it's an area we really need to understand. There are many different potential approaches. I think when we think about the responsibility of Norway or the US, my home country, as big consumers of fossil fuels, as big producers of fossil fuels, I think we have a special responsibility. We have to think about the consequences of our CO2 emissions in a very serious way, and the sales of these fuels. In many ways, they're poisoning the environment. And there's this terrible injustice about the setup, which is African countries, some of the poor Asian and Latin American countries were not the countries that emitted all the CO2. It was the North American, European, and Asian countries mainly that are emitting CO2, that are leading to global warming. But the price is going to be paid in poor African, Asian, Latin American countries. So I think we do have a responsibility. There are some promising approaches through foreign aid that have been explored, and ways to maybe adapt to a warming climate. We're at a point with the climate where it's very clear now that there will be warming in the coming decades just because of the CO2 we've already emitted. We can't go back in time. Of course, we have to reduce emissions to prevent future increases, but adaptation will be critical in the next couple of decades. And there are some promising approaches. I'll give you one example. This one is actually from India, but related and very relevant for Africa. There's been a long-standing rebellion, insurgency in eastern India called the Naxalite Rebellion. And researchers have found, very related to the research I presented yesterday in my talk, that in the hot, dry years, there are increases in local rebel activity through the Naxalite rebellion. It turns out the government of India, about a decade ago, expanded the largest social program in the world. It's called NREGA. It's a national employment guarantee in rural India. And they rolled it out across India over time. And it turns out that when this program, which guarantees a job to poor rural Indians whenever they want it, mainly on public works and road construction, those kinds of jobs, when that program gets expanded to the area, the relationship between extreme climate and the Naxalite rebellion becomes much weaker. It falls by more than half. So that suggests that if you provide people with the resources, the food, and the basic livelihood that they need, they're going to be less likely to join rebellions, support the rebels, et cetera. So I think that's a lesson that could be brought to other countries, and it's something that Norway and the US and other wealthy countries could help to fund. So it'd be the sort of thing that we could use our resources to help countries adapt to extreme climate.
From your standpoint, where would you like research to go on conflict and climate in the years to come? What are promising research avenues on this topic?
I think the research is going to be critical, and the research will go well beyond economics here. Beyond things like social programs where we have expertise, there's going to be a need to develop technologies in agriculture, for instance. So drought-resistant crops, other types of technologies that can help African economies and the agricultural sector deal with a changing climate. That kind of basic scientific research is going to be critical. On the economic side, I want us to go deeper in understanding the mechanisms. We already talked about the economic channels and the psychological mechanisms. We're still learning as researchers exactly how these work, but understanding how they work will be critical for designing interventions to make them better. So there really is a whole world of research to be done on this, and the clock is ticking. The world is warming. We need to make progress on these issues in the next 10 years. And so, again, speaking to an audience like the eager, smart Norwegian students here, many of whom I'm sure are idealistic and want to do the right thing for the planet, I think there's really a career and work and research to be done on this if they have interest in these issues.
Excellent. With those words, I'd like to thank Ted Miguel for having coffee with us here at FAIR. It was a pleasure talking with you, and I look forward to the next time.
Tusen tack.
Thank you.
Thanks.